Welcome to a special edition of our Author Spotlights. Today we are celebrating the life and career of Sharon Kay Penman. On January 22nd of this year, the writing world, and in particular the historical fiction world, lost one of our greatest treasures, author Sharon Kay Penman. Sharon was the author of 10 critically acclaimed historical novels and 4 medieval mysteries. Her first mystery, The Queen's Man, was a finalist for an Edgar Award for Best First Mystery from the Mystery Writers of America. A lawyer by training, she was a full-time novelist by her mid-30s. She lived in England and Wales and later in Mays Landing, New Jersey. Her first novel, The Sun in Splendor, about Richard III, was published in 1982. In that book, she set the style for what readers could expect from her novels, her brand, so to speak. A world that was meticulously researched and brought to life with material she gathered from years of research. In Britain and at her libraries, both the one in town and the one she created at home, spanning thousands of texts. And if you knew Sharon, you would know that she had collections of information from the strangest of places. She really was a collector of curious facts and information. And she was always generous with her knowledge, whether that meant giving lectures, advising new writers, or promoting works by her fellow historical fiction novelists. She did turn away from writing for a short time and pursued a career in tax law, but she soon returned to her passion of writing. Across her 14 novels, she estimated that the majority of her work was based on fact, and that was something she was really adamant to sticking to. If you've read any of her lengthy author's notes, you'll know what I mean. Sharon passed away this January at the age of 75, far too soon, but leaving memories that span the globe. Sharon was also a longtime member of HNS, and I actually first met her at the conference in Schaumburg, at least in person. In fact, I had struck up correspondence with her a year earlier. I had been reading her books since I was a teen, and when my first novel came out, my editor asked me to reach out to colleagues for book blurbs. As a new writer who barely knew this community existed, I didn't have any colleagues, so I did what any novice writer would do. I researched, I Googled, and I emailed my heroes. And I was lucky. Not only did Sharon write back and read my book and write that blurb, she introduced my book to her readers and introduced me to HNS. So when I met her in the flesh, I feel like I knew her already. She had such a generous spirit, and I think that's something that you're going to hear a lot about in the next hour. Today, we're fortunate to be hearing from 4 of Sharon's friends who can also speak to her great kindness and vivacity. We're joined in person by 3, and 1 has submitted a video that I'm going to share with you. So first, I'd like to introduce Margaret George. Margaret is the award-winning author of 8 epic biographical novels focusing on the Tudor era and the ancient world. 6 of these New York Times bestsellers, with 21 foreign editions and over 2 million sold internationally since her debut in 1986. Margaret shared this quote. She's been a longtime member of HNS, where she was a keynote speaker at 2009, that meeting in Schaumburg, and considers it her literary home base and the place where she has found many friends. Margaret, I turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be able to speak about Sharon, and I'm sure that she's with us in many ways. She brought so much to the world, and the world has lost so much now that she's no longer in it. But she's still here with us, I feel. And speaking of the meeting in Schaumburg in 2009, yes, I was a speaker there. I was the lesser keynote speaker, and the greater keynote speaker was going to be Edward Rutherford. And suddenly something happened in his family, and he just couldn't come at almost the last minute. And so we appealed to Sharon, could she please come in and save us? And she's so generous, and she just didn't think twice about it. She came right away with actually no notice at all from New Jersey out to Chicago, gave a wonderful talk, and that's when a lot of people actually got to see her and meet her in person. I had met her in person before that, and I'll tell you how we became friends, because I've known her for like 34 years. She published The Sun in Splendor in 1982, and it was a revisionist take on Richard III. And so my book about Henry VIII, my first novel, was published in 1986, and it was we happened to have the same publisher in England. And so publishers always ask other authors, would you please give a quote for this poor, this new debut author? But asking a supporter of Richard III to read, and give a good quote about Henry VIII, the Tudors, because it was Henry's father who had beaten Richard on the battlefield and taken away his crown, was really asking a lot. But Sharon, being a good soul that she was, agreed to do this, and she read the book, and she gave a very nice comments about it. But she told me, she said, I'm not converted to Henry. She said, but I did like the writing. And, as the rest of us know, she also was a great correspondent. So although I had not met her in person at that point, we did strike up quite a lively correspondence, and she would write very long letters, like her books were very long books. And, her personality would really show through these letters. They're just like her sitting there. But in 1996, when she had started writing her murder mysteries, she actually was on a book tour, and she came to Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I live. And she was speaking in a very small mystery bookstore very close to my house. And so I got to come and hear her talk. We got to spend the day together. She came over to my house. We had dinner. That was just great fun. And I was very impressed to meet her in person. She was even more, her personality was even stronger in person. But that's how I got to know her in person. And then after that, I saw her in Schaumburg. She was always very solicitous and interested in my work. She was always interested, as everybody will say, in everybody else's work, and as well as sharing her own with you. And so she was very eager to encourage me in my work. And she once sent me this Boudica mouse pad because I had said I wanted to write a book about Boudica. So she kept encouraging me. And I must say, I've kept this. And, maybe someday I will write that book about Boudica. The idea has not gone away completely. But she would do little surprise things like that for her friends. She was very, very thoughtful. One thing about her meticulous research, which you'll hear over and over, is that while she was speaking to the people at the mystery book store, she apologized to her readers because she had had a red squirrel in a scene in England. And she had since found out that red squirrels were not native to England. And she wanted to clear this up so that nobody would be mistaken and ever think there were red squirrels in England. And she would always put these things in the footnotes, in the author's quote. She would always be cleaning them up, and then when Facebook came along and she could put her notes in there about things, she would do that. So her work speaks for itself, and I'm sure we'll hear many more things about her work. We wrote similar types of books. They were long books. They were tended to be very fact laden and very tell the whole story kind of from beginning to end. And so we were kind of two of a kind, and I felt very very bonded to her in many ways. But greatness is not measured by work alone, and there's always a higher measure. And that Bible quote, the famous Bible quote, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am become a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal, describes her well because she had great love for life and for people. She had multitudes of friends and fans, and each one was singular and precious to her. I personally experienced this just this past December, which I want to share with you. I asked if she could write me a recommendation letter for an organization I wanted to join, and they had requested a letter from someone in my field who was familiar with my work, and she just seemed the natural person to do that. So how could I know that when I sent that letter, it was coming just at the time she had received this bad medical diagnosis? And in true heroic form, she just apologized a couple of days later for not getting back to me immediately. She did share the information about the medical situation, but she treated it very lightly. And these are her exact words from the email she wrote. She said, I don't want you to worry about me either. I'll be fine. As long as it is not COVID-19 or the medieval leprosy that cursed poor King Baldwin, I'm not going to complain. Well, I took her at her word and I didn't worry. But I was so shocked when she passed away just a few weeks later. And incidentally, with all this going on in her life, she sat down and wrote that letter and got that off to the organization and told me. And, you know, to be able to do that, I mean, she just was such a special and generous and just giving person. And I'm just, you know, really in awe of it. I wish I could thank her in person again. You know, I did thank her, but I didn't understand really what it meant that she had done it. So all this makes her sound very saintly and colorless, but nothing could be further from the truth. She had a wicked sense of humor, as you can tell from a remark about King Baldwin and his leprosy. She had unexpected interests. Now, I don't know why I always think that whatever period someone's writing in, that their house is going to look like that. So that if you're a medievalist, you will not have any electricity, and you will have manuscripts that are scrolls, things like that, and your interests are going to be lute playing. She was a Green Bay Packers fan. She was an ardent Green Bay Packers fan, and because I lived in Wisconsin, she assumed I too was an ardent Green Bay Packers fan. So she was always writing me about the latest thing about the Packers, and she was worried about this game and that game. And I didn't want to disappoint her. I don't know that I was really not into this as much as she was. Although if you live in Wisconsin, you're always going to be sort of into it. So just think, though, she is a woman who loved Richard III and Aaron Rodgers almost equally. Now, there was not anybody else like this. So she, again, very special person, many things that we'll miss. She also suspected that her computer was invaded by a demon, and because it was always tripping her up, and it's true, it would eat part of her emails and drop things, and she was always having troubles with it, and she gave it a name, and it was Melisande. But it seemed like no matter how many new computers she got, Melisande seemed to migrate into each one of them. And she never sort of was able to exorcise Melisande. In fact, she had a problem with the letter that she wrote to me because Melisande ate part of it. And she had dropped a paragraph out, and she had written back and said, now I've got the paragraph back. She's given it back to me. You know, what a person. You know, I just feel like, Sharon, we really miss you. And we really, really miss you, but we're so grateful we had you for as long as we did. And you'll always be with us.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from a video from Stephanie Churchill Ling, who runs one of Sharon's Facebook groups. So Stephanie served time as a corporate paralegal in Washington, D.C., and then stayed at home to raise her children. She stumbled upon writing as a career path, one she never saw coming. As a result of writing a long-winded review of the book Lionheart, Stephanie became fast friends with its New York Times bestselling author, Sharon Kay Penman, who uttered the fateful words, "Have you ever thought about writing?" Stephanie has since published 3 historical novels. She lives in the Minneapolis area with her husband, 2 children, 2 dogs, while trying to survive the murderous intentions of a Minnesota winter. So bear with me a second while I share my screen. Okay.
Thanks for inviting me to say a few words about my dear friend, Sharon Kay Penman. My name is Stephanie Ling, and I've published 3 historical fantasy novels inspired by the Wars of the Roses under the pen name Stephanie Churchill. Sharon gets the credit or the blame, I always told her, for starting me on my writing journey. And I thought I would start off by telling my story first, and then end with some special insights into the beginning of Sharon's own writing journey in her own words. It was the 3rd shelf from the bottom, a paperback in the middle of that shelf. The cherry red color on the spine that drew me. I've always enjoyed digging into my family history, and as a descendant of several Mayflower passengers, it's always been easy to piggyback on the research of countless historians who dug up the histories of those individuals and connecting them to many large British families. As a result, I found some familiar names on the cover blurb of that cherry red book. Hamlin de Warren, a name with Ham in it, intrigued me. Of course, that book was When Christ and His Saints Slept, and I bought it that day. The thing is, of course, that I never bought books. I couldn't afford to buy books. It was 1998, I was newly married, and I was working to put my husband through law school. One didn't just buy books when one needed to eat and pay rent as well. It's funny that I can still see that book on the shelf in that Barnes & Noble in downtown Minneapolis. I honestly didn't read that much historical fiction. I read historical nonfiction, a lot of historical myth and fantasy novels, but not regular historical fiction. So why did I buy that book? I'm not really sure, but in a way, that purchase was going to be the catalyst that set me on a road that would change many things about my life. I just didn't know it for quite a few years after it. I met Sharon for the first time in St. Paul, Minnesota, about 5 years later at a book signing in October 2003 for her book, The Dragon's Lair. She was on a book tour there, and I sat in the back of the crowd. And as she spoke, she struck me as a very gracious and easily approachable person. But of course, I was still tongue-tied when I met her. I mumbled something about having loved Sun and Splendor, and she smiled kindly, then signed my book to Stephanie, who agrees with me about Richard. It wasn't until the advent of social media, Facebook in particular, where Sharon interacted frequently, that the dear lady really got her hooks into me with her charm and approachability. And I certainly wasn't the only one. The stories don't end of those I hear about who felt astonishment when she interacted with their comments, addressed them by name, and then asked them questions as if she truly valued their opinion. So I wasn't alone in that. It was this honest interaction and interest in her readers that eventually connected she and I at a closer level. It was October 2011, and Lionheart was just published. I loved it so much, I contacted our local public radio station to see if I could get Sharon interviewed. Nothing came of it, but Sharon was floored. Soon after that, in her wonderful Facebook fan club, I wrote an embarrassingly enthusiastic comment about how much I loved Lionheart and how much the book had changed my understanding of Richard, along with a self-deprecating comment about how much I sounded like a groupie. Our Facebook exchange at that point went like this, and I quote, "Sharon, writers deserve groupies a lot more than people like the Kardashians, Stephanie. I can't tell you how much I appreciate feedback like yours. Writers rarely get a detailed response. Mind you, we are delighted to be told that someone loved the book, but it's wonderful when the reader delves beneath the surface and elaborates a bit." Stephanie, "Well, if you really want it, I actually intended to sit down and write a really long email to you spelling out things in more detail, but then I started to feel a little silly and self-conscious about it, so I changed my mind." Sharon, "Stephanie, you send me that and you're in my will. Seriously, that would be beyond wonderful." Needless to say, I did. 12 pages. I still can't believe I wrote a 12-page review of Lionheart. There was no reason for it beyond her casual comment about writers rarely getting detailed feedback. Needless to say, she was stunned, and her editor was stunned. And I'm still a little embarrassed to admit that I did it. She did not put me in her will, but I got something much better. I gained a friend who would eventually grow as close to me as family. As a result of that review, she sent me a signed first edition of Sun and Splendor, and then she recommended that I try my own hand at writing. In the process, she became my mentor and my dear friend. She edited the first chapters of my book, told me countless stories of her experiences in 30 years of publishing, so I would understand the industry better. She was always happy to help promote my books. And the beautiful thing about Sharon is that she did this for so many others. I still come across stories of how Sharon helped begin someone's writing career. She just saw it as part of her duty to keep the art alive and well. And in so doing, she endeared herself to a countless number of people. And really, that's why so many of you are smiling now, because I know many of you were inspired to write because of her books. because of a personal connection you had with her, because she took the time to invest in you as a writer. She had that way with people, connecting people across the globe over their love of history and the stories of people long since dead. Last April, I was able to help Sharon's family by traveling out to her home in New Jersey to help them sort through Sharon's legacy. In the process of sorting rooms full of books, boxes of files, and lots of original manuscripts, in the process we came across a significant journal. It sparsely covers the years 1969 to 1973. I pored over it and I found some very interesting tidbits, which I thought would be interesting to those of us who loved her and her books. And I thought I would read a selection of those journal entries to you now. In 1969, Sharon was 23 and a college student at the University of Texas in Austin. On January 14, 1969, an entry from her journal reads, there are several emotional currents that have the power to move me deeply. My consuming interest in Richard III, my attachment to New Orleans, the unhealed sorrow of last June. I feel all these emotions with a sharp, swift intensity. I also have a strong desire to travel. In the summer of 1969, she fulfilled a lifelong dream to live in Hawaii. Her June 29, 1969 entry reads, I made a mistake tonight. I took out my white notebook and I reread some of what I've written in the past 2 years. It reassured me that I can write, and I needed that reassurance. By December of that year, she had left Hawaii after spending time in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And at this point, she was in Arizona. December 27, 1969, she writes, and now it is a brief moment until the decade will end. 1970. I have a good feeling about it. Instinct or wishful thinking, I'm not sure which. I still want to travel and to write, and with luck and determination, I might do both. 2 years later, in December of 1971, she finds herself back in New Jersey, attending law school at Rutgers. On the 20th of December, she writes, when I was 10, I created a world more to my liking. The civilization was of my making, and I was God. Now I do the same thing with my writing. And as I conjure up real beings, endow them with life, I blur reality, perhaps even reject it. The journal that I'm reading from is very sparse, and there are a lot of jumps in time between entries. She journals about this tendency often, chiding herself for not being consistent. 6 days after the entry I just read, she writes, last Monday I felt the urge to write for the first time in 2 years. I wrote, and then I folded the paper and put it away. I went back into the past, not very far, just as far as 1968. Back to New Orleans and those first exciting ventures into the life of a man dead nearly 500 years. I wrote often that summer, and then nothing. She means her journaling, of course. For 2 years, nothing. Months in Honolulu, San Francisco, Los Angeles, months in Atlantic City. So many quiet hours of thought, returning to the nest, to the sea, the writing. 2 years of frustration and pleasure and polishing, learning to cut words like diamonds. All my energy, all my ambition, all went into my book. Yes, I call it that now. It might never be finished, may never see the light of day, but after 3.5 years, I've earned the right. It definitely is a book. So much of me went into writing, of another sort those 2 years ago. Richard, always Richard, more than a magnificent obsession, my lifelong companion. I doubt if I'll ever finish that tale. The historical and psychological implications alone are staggering. It's my life work. And my passions, what are they? First and above all, Richard Plantagenet and his world. History, travel, New Orleans, California, Hawaii, and always England. The Yorkshire of the Brontes, and the ghostly shadows of Middleham. Cornwall, Ireland, emerald green and high drama. Good writing, even if it isn't mine. The law, almost as much as it frightens me. Cats, all the places I've yet to see. March, when the swallows come back to Capistrano. The Old Testament, Mark Twain, the fun of dramatizing in brilliant, splashing colors. Green sleeves, a haunting echo across 4 centuries, once heard and remembered for always. Those so sweet moments when words come easily to me and in the right order, with the right meaning. Flashes of hope when I truly believe we might learn to live together in some semblance of harmony. And tomorrow, always tomorrow. Even in her journaling, she was poetic.
Yeah.
Some of her entries just blow me away. So at this point, it's almost a full year after the entry I just read, and Sharon is still attending law school in New Jersey, but something horrendous has happened. Someone broke into her car, parked outside her apartment, thinking probably only to steal the beautiful leather satchel in the back seat. But what the thief didn't know was that inside the satchel was a manuscript, a completed manuscript, nearly 2,000 pages long, hand-typed and ready for submission. We know that manuscript today as The Sun and Splendor, but to the young woman who came out to her car the next day to discover the theft, her life work was gone. So it's now November 12th, 1972, a month after the theft, and you can hear traces of her bitterness, anger, and that wry wit we've all come to know and love. All life is sleeping now, while I try vainly to turn off my mind, and Mei Ling, her cat, stalks the apartment in eerie, unsettling pursuit of an unseen enemy, for all the world like the murdered ghost of Hamlet's father. Or am I reaching for that one? It's amazing, or amusing, how profound one becomes as the dark drags on. Basic immutable truth number 1. Never, never read Dorothy Parker except in the glare of the noonday sun and with the high spirits of a lottery winner. Basic truth number 2. The harder you try not to think of whatever vulture happens to be currently hovering at your shoulder, the more conscious you are of the flapping in the air, the presence of its evil. Basic truth number 3. Whatever is written at Fitzgerald's 3 o'clock forever should be shredded as soon as the ink dries. Though of course it won't. The egotism of the writer survives all else, and unlike virtue, emerges triumphant once more. Mei Ling is still seeking her private prey for all the world, like one of the imps of hell. There's something at once sinister and fascinating about a black cat on the prowl. Little wonder earlier ages burned them as Satan's collaborators. Perhaps I should make use of her. After all, I have a frightening image of the cat as evil incarnate on my wall. A demon red light to spill over onto the floor. A chant to murmur in the dark and my own medium to act as guide. What more can I need? What should I ask from the high priest of Satanism? The return of my manuscript? In all honesty, there's precious little I wouldn't do to have it back, or failing that, to cause pain to the one who took it. Or perhaps my desires are much simpler and basic on a Sunday morning. Perhaps I'm not able to deal with griefs or guilts or with anything more complex or elemental than a simple need to sleep. Another dark month passes in New Jersey, and matters are still unbearable for her. The weather matches her mood, it's dark and gloomy, and on December 12th, 1972, I still grieve for a lost book. It was so much a part of me, and now the emptiness is nigh well unbearable. I can't bring myself to think of it, to try to pick up the scattered pieces, yet I do dwell on it despite myself. 5 months later, some hope has returned. On May 13, 1973, she writes, and it was in March that I began to write again. It took 5 full months before I was able to try to rescue what I could. A remembered sentence, a studied phrase, a random thought. Today it is 7 months since the loss of the book. 7 months I couldn't relive at any price. Time is not always the healer. It can be an illuminator as well. What might have been. I can't believe there are 4 words so painful, so unbearable in any language. Of course, we all know she would rewrite the novel, and it's also likely that the rewriting made it a better novel than it would have been the first time. It was published in 1982, and one could argue it changed the way we see Richard III, whether we want it to or not. She, of course, went on to write her popular Welsh trilogy, 6 novels about her beloved Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine and their so-called Devil's Brood, and then last but not least, her 4 Justin de Quincey mysteries, attaining bestseller status for many of them. I thought it would be appropriate to finish with a quote from one of her books, The King's Ransom. This is the death scene of her beloved Eleanor. It's different circumstances, of course, but it's a touching scene that somehow feels right to share. And so I end with this. She was burning with fever, but she welcomed it, eager to shed the body that had become her enemy. It would be soon now, for she was slipping her moorings, one by one, tethered by gossamer threads that trembled with each labored breath she drew. Gradually, she became aware that she was no longer alone. She opened her eyes, but she saw only swirling shadows, candles that glimmered like distant stars in the dark. God's bones, woman, how much longer are you going to make us wait?
I would like to introduce Elizabeth Chadwick, who many of you know, of course. She's a multi-award-winning, top-selling historical novelist with 27 novels in print, translated into 18 languages. Her novel, The Greatest Night, is a New York Times bestseller and has been optioned for film and TV. And her novel, The Scarlet Lion, was included in founder of the Historical Novel Society's Richard Lee's top 10 novels of the decade. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I first met Sharon in mid-1990s when she came to England on a book tour for, gosh, my mind's gone blank now. It was a book tour for one of her novels, and she came to Waterstones in Leicester. We'd already spoken a few times via our publishers, but not personally as such. She'd given me a quote for, I think it was Daughter of the Grail, and she told me she was coming to England, and if I'd like to come and meet her at Leicester. And this was all by her publishers, not personally at this time. So I dropped along to Leicester Waterstones and sat with the rest of her readers, listened to her give an excellent talk, had my novels signed, and then spoke to her briefly at the end. It was quite late at night and she was going back to her hotel, but she said, hang on, I'll give you my address and I'll write to you once I'm back from my tour, and you must write to me. And that was how we actually got started with our correspondence. It was When Christ and His Saints Slept. That was the novel. Remembered it now. My brain's come online now. There were often long gaps between our letters because at the time, in the early 90s, Sharon had some elderly parents she was caring for, as well as doing her writing. And we both got contracted novels, but the letters did continue at a steady pace, on and off when we had time. She was always keen to know about me and how I was doing, rather than speaking about herself. She wanted to know about my family. She would talk about the world situation. She was often very concerned about the way the world was going. I think she often got quite anxious about that. But that was great compassion and caring. We had a mutual interest in animals, especially dogs. She would often talk about her white Alsatians, Shadow, and her poodle, Caitlin. And that was a source of joy between us. I'd always loved her novels as a reader before I was a published author, and I think one of Sharon's special writing skills, which I've not found in any other author, although I've enjoyed all her novels all the way through with characters and descriptions and history, is the fact that she can write medieval politics and glue you to them and make them really fascinating and interesting and organic. I've not found any other writer that can do that at all, and I think that's very, very special. And she can do it with this panache and humanity. In our letters, Sharon was always enthusiastic about her writing and her discoveries, and she wanted to share things as well and help out other authors. So, for example, this is a letter this was actually an email when she knew I was writing Temple of Silts about William Marshall's time in the Holy Land. And she said to me, I think you are now working on William Marshall's The Lost Years, right? His time in the Holy Land. I'm sure you found all the usual suspects in your research, but I wanted to mention a few that are off the beaten path. The Crusaders in the Holy Land by Merlin Benveniste was a godsend to me when I was writing Lionheart, and now my current novel, for example. Do you want to know the population of Jaffa or Acre in the 12th century? Here it is. Maps of the city or castles, diagrams, here again. He even tells the reader the night service owed for each lordship. It was published back in 1974, but it is well worth looking for, containing a wealth of hard-to-find information for interested readers and historical novelists. So she knew that I was writing in a similar area, but a different story, and she was keen to help me out with books that would help me on my road. She was also very enthusiastic about her own research and wrote to me in great delight. I had a huge find recently, which made me as happy as if I'd won the lottery. I actually found the will of Richard's sister, this is Richard I here, online at the British History Online site, and it was even translated into English. The will is Round's calendar of documents relating to France, which I've been trying to find for years. It has some heartbreaking charters of Eleanor soon after Richard's death, in which she speaks of her very dear son, Richard, and once as that mighty man. Or then again, I had to tell you about this, for I know you'll understand why I am so delighted with my discovery. I've often wondered why no one had ever done a biography of William de Longchamp. Well, I found something even better. Someone did an entire thesis about Longchamp and the politics of sexual slander in the 12th century. Even better, I was able to buy it, and without having to take out a second mortgage on my house. I am now waiting with bated breath for it to arrive. And again, there was this generosity. If I find anything in there of use to you in your third Eleanor book, I will be sure to pass it on. And this is just so typical of Sharon. It was just her complete nature through and through. One of the many things that I really loved about our friendship, and especially about Sharon, was her dry, often self-deprecating and very mischievous sense of humour. And I've actually smiled and chuckled to myself several times while going through our pages of correspondence, both email and letter. And I've got some examples here of that sense of humour. So I think she'd had perhaps a difficult day one day online. And so on living in medieval times versus now. Yes, they spilled a lot of blood too, but at least they did not have to deal with social media. And she finishes it, love from me and my support spaniel. I love that. And then she commiserated with me when I'd had a burglary, and she informed me that I am having a security system installed this week myself. What I'd really like would be a moat and drawbridge, but that would be against our zoning laws, which was another, just a chuckle. I reenact with, or I used to reenact with an early medieval society, and I used to send her little snippets of what I discovered doing reenactment. And she commented on one letter, of course, if I had a chance to dress up and pretend to be Eleanor of Aquitaine, I'd probably never get around to writing about her. Once she had a bit of amusement. This was just so amusing to me about a little bit about her just readership and favourite novels. Is The Greatest Night the fan favourite of your books? With me, Dragons usually wins, followed closely by Sun, which would mean that I peaked early and it's been downhill ever since. And then she's put a beautiful little smiley emoticon beside it. So it was just wonderful. But my absolute favourite one, when I was looking through, and something that because the time has gone on, we perhaps a little bit forgotten about, but which made me laugh. was Sharon's passion for Sean Bean.
Yes, yes.
And a man in boots. And so this was from March 1996. Dearest Elizabeth, I've had a miserable week, laid low with the flu. Fortunately, a friend had taped all the Masterpiece Theatre's Richard Sharp episodes and gave them to me as a birthday gift, bless her. You know I must have been at death's door, for I kept getting chills. And how could any woman get cold while watching Sean Bean? Caitlin, her little dog at the time, Caitlin and I curled up in bed and watched Sharp swagger through Spain, actually the Ukraine, in a haze of cannon smoke, dealing with the French and all those high-born dolts masquerading as British officers. I doubt if Caitlin appreciates the finer points of 19th century military dress, what with being a poodle and all, but I certainly do. Uniforms and high boots do wonders for a man. And you could just see the twinkle in her eye. And there's just this, I do remember all the, on Facebook, the exchanges about Sean Bean from those And dear Sharon, even when unwell in this last period of her life, she still had that lovely self-deprecating touch. You know, as Margaret pointed out in hers, leprosy seems to have been a particular theme at the time. And this is it's poignant, but it's beautiful, and it's got that just amusing edge. Dearest Elizabeth, it seems like forever since we've connected. For so long we've been like ships in the night, blinking our lights at each other as we pass in cyberspace. I've been dealing with health issues that have cramped my style. Although writing about King Baldwin of Jerusalem definitely helped put my problems in perspective, at least I don't have leprosy. I think that's just so beautiful and poignant, and so typically Sharon. I have to say, I shall so miss her emails and her frequent posts on Facebook, where she interacted so willingly with her readers. And I've spoken to many of you readers in that community since she passed. And I also know many of you through Sharon and as online friends myself. And it's become obvious how much she reached out to so many of us, often personally and in depth. Nothing was ever shallow for Sharon, be it friendships, passions, causes, research. And how she found the time and the energy to do all this, she'll just never know. I think there's enormous sadness that she is no longer with us, but we still have her essence in her books and the joy of sharing those books that brings us together from all corners of the world. She was one on her own, but she shone to the many.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce David Blixt. David's work is consistently described as intricate, taut, and breathtaking. His novels span the Roman Empire to early Renaissance Italy, through the Elizabethan era to the Victorian age, with a series following daredevil journalist Nellie Bly. In 2021, he revealed that while researching Bly, he had discovered 11 lost novels by Bly herself. David's novels combine a love of theater with a deep respect for the quirks and passions of history. As the Historical Novel Society says, be prepared to burn the midnight oil. It's well worth it. David?
Thank you, Vanitha. I came to Sharon as an actor. In 2012, my wife was directing a production of Shakespeare's Richard III at her theater in Michigan. I was playing both Edward and Henry Tudor at the end of the show. It was a big show with a large cast, and Jan put me in charge of the cast gift. I immediately bought everyone in the company, designers, cast, crew, copies of Sun and Splendor, so that the company wouldn't believe Shakespeare's propaganda had anything to do with reality. I didn't know Sharon at all at that point outside of her books. I'd been published a couple years earlier, so I knew how pleasant it was to hear from readers who were giving out copies of my books. So I went to Sharon's website and told her that we were giving out 25 copies of Sun. Sharon, being Sharon, immediately reached out with the offer of signed book plates. If you can provide me with a list of all 25 cast and crew, I can make them out personally to each one. I am just so sorry that I don't live close enough to catch your show. That was my first experience of the generous heart of Sharon Kay Penman. Right around that time, they discovered Richard's body, and she wrote with great excitement. I winced when I read that he suffered from scoliosis, for this had been the bane of my own existence. Poor Richard, living in an age without chiropractors. My head says it would be fair to bury him at Leicester Cathedral since they made this happen, but my heart is set on York Minster. As you can tell, I am already sure they got the right guy. We were soon writing each other every week. From the first, she wrote hilariously of the twin banes of her existence, technology and her health. She was always cursing her computers, Melisande, for hindering her ongoing battle against the deadline dragon. She once wrote, I sometimes get scolded for giving my computers names that are self-fulfilling prophecies. Demon Spawn, Rosemary's Baby, and Lucy, short for Lucifer's Handmaiden. But I tried the positive thinking approach and it did not help at all. Demon Spawn's original name was Merlin. Then there was her health. After her second surgery to combat skin cancer, she wrote me, I suspect I'll end up looking like one of those German students in the 1920s who gloried in their dueling scars. I look like a chipmunk with the mumps and have a spectacular black eye into the bargain. Or later, returning from a trip, she wrote, my back decided to escalate our war of wills to where I contemplated getting my mail directed to my chiropractor's office. Discovering I was an author, she not only read my novels, but was soon promoting them and interviewing me on her blog. This was not uncommon. I remember her once referring to my books as her favorite series of historical fiction. The thing is, I am dead certain she said this to countless people. And I am equally certain she meant it every time. She was profoundly generous with her time, her enthusiasm, her affection. Sharon gave so much of herself, not only in her novels, but in how she treated everyone around her. As Margaret said, talking to Sharon was to have her endlessly interested in you. Elizabeth, too. It's exactly that. She was eager to know you and was forever peppering you with questions. And it was maddening how often she apologized for not writing back promptly, as if she owed us a second of her time. When we did my first interview on her blog, we started a funny bit where I flirted with her and she held me in great disdain. Immediately, our emails became full of darlings and dearests and sweethearts. My wife said if I was going to have an affair, she was glad it was with Sharon. Over the years, we shared our mutual fondness for football, her Packers and my Bears, for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The West Wing, Game of Thrones, and the Sharp series. You're a Sharp fan too. I loved that series. And yes, I am shallow enough to admit Sean Bean was the major draw. There is something about a man in uniform with high boots. She rarely spoke of her internal life. Every now and then she'd reveal a tidbit about her past, but she was far more interested in talking about her characters. You can always tell if I do not like a character in one of my books. He or she has no sense of humor. They are usually cheap too. I will be able to resume our chats, David, as soon as I kill Richard off. Do you find it therapeutic to kill off characters you dislike? I hate doing in the ones I like, of course, but I can find a certain satisfaction in murdering the bad guys. Sadly, they often die off stage, like Heinrich von Hohenstaufen in Ransom. He has the dubious distinction of being the only utter sociopath I've written about in the course of my career. We finally got to meet at the HNS conference in 2015. She attended both of my sword fighting workshops, and I moderated a panel that included Sharon, Margaret, and Ann Easter Smith. The night we were all arriving, I got this email. I saw you across the lobby as I was checking in, and I was about to rush over to you, but you were talking, and I didn't want to interrupt you. When I looked back, you had vanished. I'm looking forward to embracing you, dear heart. When we met the next day, she protested she was too frail to participate in the sword fighting. Of course, I'll be strictly a bystander when the dueling starts. Trust me, you would not want to see a senior citizen wielding swords and daggers. Nonetheless, I managed to get a broadsword into her hands. She was never one to let age or physical ailments diminish her joy. That year was a particularly hard one for me. A lot of personal tragedy leading up to before the conference. Among them was the loss of a friend to colon cancer. I mentioned Aaron's death to Sharon and that her widower was a fan. She asked what his favorite book of hers was and for his address. He was kind enough this month to share her letter with me, so I can share it with you. Dearest Rob, I hope it does not seem strange to receive a letter of condolence from a stranger but our mutual friend, David, told me about the tragic loss of your wife, Erin. I am so sorry that you both had to endure such an ordeal. My mother's family has a sad history of colon cancer. It claimed 2 of her sisters and several of her nieces and nephews, my cousins. It is a truly insidious ailment. I wish there were healing words to offer, but we both know there are none. Please know that you've been in my thoughts ever since David confided in me about Erin's illness. All good wishes, Sharon Kay Penman. For once, though, Sharon's wrong. Rereading her emails for this and rereading her books, I found a lot of healing in her words. When I suggested reading something today of hers, I was tempted to read Anne's death scene from Son, because there's one line in particular that sticks with me. It'd always be harder to die if you've had little happiness in your life, much harder. I never told you, but I felt so guilty for the longest time after Bella's death because she'd had so little joy, and I had so much. But Sharon wouldn't have wanted us to focus on death. She liked meetings more than partings. So instead, I chose a passage that resonates with my first meeting with her. It's from Here Be Dragons, where King John's daughter, Joanna, journeys to meet her grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, for the first time. The Benedictine Abbey of Fontevraud was situated in the province of Anjou, not far from the crossing of the rivers Vienne and Loire. It was a rich land, famed for its vineyards, lush and green in the summer sun, and Joanna's journey from Rouen should have been a pleasant one. But the threat of war overhung the countryside, hovering like wood smoke along the horizon, and Joanna soon discovered that distance did little to ease her fears for her father's safety. She was nervous, moreover, about meeting her grandmother. Eleanor was entering her 81st year, an age no less vast to Joanna than that of the ancient gnarled oaks shadowing their path. Joanna's craving for family, for belonging, was the mainspring of her being. But as Fontevraud Abbey came into sight, she found herself beset by misgivings. She had no right to her father's name, was accepted at court only on his sufferance. Would Eleanor welcome a grandchild born of sin? The room was in shadows, shielded from the sun by heavy linen hangings. Joanna groped her way forward blindly, knelt before the woman sitting in an oaken upright chair, much like a throne. Come closer, child, so I might see you. The voice was not at all the croaking whisper Joanna had been expecting. It was clear, perfectly pitched, made her long to hear it again. Joanna rose shyly, took the hand outstretched to her. It was hot and dry, so frail she could think only of the time she'd held a captive bird within her palms. But then the fingers, long and tapering, ablaze with emerald and opal and turquoise, closed around her own, firmly, drawing her forward. For a moment, she felt a cheek pressed against her own. An exotic, beguiling fragrance perfumed the air. As her grandmother embraced her, she heard the whisper of silk. She lifted her lashes, looked into hazel eyes much like her own. So, you are Joanna, Eleanor said. And when she smiled, Joanna, caught like so many others before her by the potent pull of that sudden, capricious charm, gave up her heart with reckless and innocent abandon. For me, that passage is like meeting Sharon all over again, a physical frailty that belies the vivacious and sharp person inside. Though her body betrayed her, her mind never dimmed, and her lion's heart never wavered. There's so much of feeling like a fraud in this business. Imposter syndrome is real. Sharon cut through all of that. You were never an imposter to her. She was able to see the writer, the person you wanted to be, and make that her reality. My characters were as real to her as they are to me. Every moment we shared was the most important one. And selfishly, I'm going to miss that vision of myself through her eyes. Humble and self-effacing as she was, I think she'd be surprised at how much she's missed. But the great thing about loving authors is that they're always there to meet all over again. Sharon, dear heart, I look forward to our next meeting. And just for this once, go Packers.
Thank you, David, Margaret, Elizabeth, and to Stephanie for sharing your memories. I feel like we've had a piece of Sharon brought back to life to us today. For everyone at home, please share your own memories on the social wall within the app. And everyone, have a good night.